Hi there and welcome. Jonathan here. These talks are offered freely so that no one is ever denied access to these practices. Your support makes a big difference. If you feel inspired to make a donation, please go to jonathanfoust.com. Thank you. I heard a theory a while back, which had some merit to it, I think. It said that some people are like Toyota Corollas, and some people are like Ferraris. A Toyota Corolla starts every time you turn the key, gets good mileage, it'll get you where you need to go. You change the oil every 10,000 miles. It'll get you to highway speed, but it'll take a little while to get there. And Ferraris are really fun to drive. They corner really, really fast. They're really, really fun. And you've got to put high-test fuel in it and get it tuned up every 6 weeks. And actually, I think sometimes in our life, we're the Toyota Corolla. You just kind of count on, just keep putting in fuel pretty steady. And other times in our life, we have to really get tuned up a lot and make sure we're running high test through, depending on what we're going through. So tonight's talk is about what's called right effort, or wise effort, which is the effort you put not just into your practice, but into your life. This is part of a series on the path of kind of eight different teachings offered by the Buddha on how to support liberation. It doesn't have to be about liberation. It can just be about maturing. It can be about developing yourself. There are three categories. The first two talks were in the area of the wisdom factors. Kind of understanding the map and the path, understanding the most skillful path, the path of least resistance. Well, the next three talks kind of cover what are called the ethical factors, which is to really examine your behavior and make sure your behavior is in alignment with your intentions. And certain behaviors will support the outcome you want. Certain behaviors will detract from it. So to evaluate that can be very, very helpful. And the last three explorations are about inner development, about caring for yourself, for your mind and for your heart. After ethics, you're really exploring how you relate to the world and how you relate to others. And how you relate to others is related to how you relate to yourself. So part of the inner factors you're cultivating are kind of fall in the category of non-harming. All the different ways that you can practice non-harming. And then about finding work in the world that's in harmony with you. And using work in a way that provides you with what you need. Food, shelter, clothing, medicine. And then the question is, what's next? Once you have the basics covered in your life, then what? If you go to Southeast Asia to join a meditation community, they will provide you with the basics. You're provided with food, with shelter, with clothing, with medicine. So then you're allowed to practice. In the ashram, we used to say, where we had our simplicity or poverty vow, that if you come here, you'll have all you need and nothing more. But it does become a question of once your basics are covered, what's next? A bigger house, nicer clothes, a bigger car, higher status. answering that question can be really helpful. How much is enough? And what really this path says is that when you have enough in your life, there are two natural movements that your heart and mind will go toward. The first is caring for others, and the second is caring for yourself. So right effort is kind of it's the engine. It's the energy that you bring to your life. And it's about being a caretaker of your own life. So the teachings in this particular part of the path really come down to two things. It's understanding what is wholesome, what's helpful, what's skillful, what's healthy, and what's meaningful for you. And understanding that which is unwholesome, that which is unhealthy, and that which will perpetuate stress and suffering in your life. So there are 4 main points here, which we'll explore, the Buddha talked about. The first is about prevention, about preventing unwholesomeness before it arises. The second is about abandoning, and that is, how do you let go of the unwholesome when it's already here? And the third is about cultivation. How do you bring up wholesome states that are not here yet? And the fourth, how do you maintain the wholesome states that are already here? So it has to do with maintenance. So this first point about preventing unwholesome states before they have arisen. When I lived in the ashram, one of the things we would note is that one of the great things about getting up at 4:30 in the morning was not just the benefit of your practice, but all the trouble you didn't get into because you had to go to bed early. Last night I went out for my evening walk, and when I came back, I had a craving for something sweet. I'm not a sweets kind of guy. I rarely have dessert, but just for some reason I really wanted something sweet before I went to bed. And I couldn't find anything because I don't eat sweets. So I'm rummaging around. I had this real craving. I thought, well, I could do like agave shots, but that didn't seem too satisfying. So I went to bed craving sweets, and I woke up early and I felt great in the morning. So it was kind of an interesting thing to see that I prevented an unwholesome state, I suppose, by not having those temptations in the house. As we've just started the year of living mindfully, got about a month into it, so I refreshed my practice of one observation and one restraint. And the restraint that I took on for this month was no media before 9 a.m. I made the mistake yesterday by checking the headlines before I did my meditation. And I read the most horrific stuff being done out there. And I tried to sit for my meditation, and I was just filled with anger and despair and a little bit of revenge on the edge, like we've got to get those bastards, And it becomes a very interesting question to reflect in your life, what are the habits that you have that drain you or that elicit unwholesome states in you? And this is where this idea of preventive medicine can be so helpful, when you really look at how you could structure your life in a really supportive way. As I was thinking about this, I remembered back in the ashram, we used to have these visiting swamis come through. And we had this one swami, and he was he was there with this little minion, and he was demonstrating these kriyas, these purification techniques. And I don't know if you've seen them. Some of them are really intense, where you can swallow cloth and pull it out and run it up through your sinus cavities. And it was pretty horrific to watch even back then. But he had this great thing. As this guy's showing us these kriya techniques, the Swami kept saying, garbage in, garbage out. Garbage in, garbage out. And I remember I said to the person next to me, what about not putting the garbage in the first place? Save you a lot of grief. I think it's safe to say we live in a toxic environment. There's so much distraction, so much noise, so much negativity. And it's not about pretending it isn't there, but it really becomes a question of really sensing how much the environment affects you. Is there some way that you can help to prevent all the unwholesome states that arise for you? It can be very helpful to do an inventory in your life. What drains you and what gives you energy? So this is a little on the power of preventive medicine. Really sensing what could you avoid that would save you a lot of grief, basically. Of course, unwholesome states arise naturally. Then the question becomes, what do you do when they present themselves to you? And this leads to the second point of the Buddha, and that is to let go of the unwholesome states when they're here. Easier said than done. So yesterday, after I had read the newspaper headlines before my meditation, and I was in some kind of swamp of sadness and rage and despair, I could definitely call that an unwholesome state. And the question became, well, how could I let go of that? This is a whole topic for a whole other talk. But it's not just don't think those thoughts. It's usually not that helpful. In fact, right now, don't think of a pink elephant. It doesn't work. We've talked a lot about the art of letting go through the acronym of RAIN. You recognize what's here. The A is to accept or allow it if you can. The I is to investigate it, to actually be intimate with it. And the N is to nurture it with compassion. And that leads to a sense of non-identification. It's a beautiful formula for being with it. Not so much about casting it out, but about really having tea with it, which can be very helpful. But I'm sure we've all grappled with that question of what do you do when you're gripped in an unwholesome, kind of unhealthy, agitated state? So there are 4 little teachings from the Buddha here. These are kind of classic teachings. The first is to contemplate the karma of the unwholesome state. So when you're in an unwholesome state, as I was, that sense of like sadness, anger, despair, you can ask yourself, if I hang on to this, what will be the long-term result? So there's sort of a recognition of if I just sit in this cycle of spinning rage and sadness and despair, it's really not going to serve me. So by asking that question, it sort of helps me view it a little bit from the outside. So if you're caught in anger, for example, you can ask yourself, what is the karma of hanging on to it? It can be very helpful. The second thing the Buddha said is you can cultivate the opposite of the state that's there. Every unwholesome state has a wholesome counterpart. So the other option I had, as I was sitting with that maelstrom of emotion, was to bring some kindness to it. Just to bring some compassion to it. And that is a very powerful force. Perhaps one of the most powerful forces there is to, in some way, cultivate a quality of loving presence. And I find for myself it just has a way of softening and a way of holding it that allows me to let it move on. The third suggestion the Buddha had is to ask if you can let it pass. And this implies that you can be the witness to it. The idea is to neither indulge into it nor deny it. So you're not hanging on to it, but you're also not saying this isn't here, but you're just letting it be, letting it pass. A little more challenging. But inevitably what it leads to is a realization of impermanence. That anything that's born out of causes and conditions, it's subject to change. And by shifting to the witness place, you become a little bit less identified with that unwholesome state. So we have contemplate the karma, cultivate the opposite of the unwholesome state, ask if you can let it pass and be the witness. And the fourth, when I heard this, I thought, really? And this has to do with forceful suppression. And that's where the Buddha said, sometimes you grit your teeth and you turn your attention elsewhere. It's an interesting part of the teaching. But I think sometimes it's helpful, where you just say, I'm not going there. I'm just not going there. And I found at times in my life, it's been very helpful to just say, no, not going there. The Tibetans have this teaching that when you're kind of lost in thought, the word they use is pet. You just cut it. Sometimes it's effective, sometimes it's not. But that becomes an interesting practice as well. But I find with all these different strategies, when you really begin to sensitize yourself to what is wholesome and unwholesome, that alone can be a very helpful insight. It's kind of binary, I find. Either what you're doing will energize you or it will deplete you. Anything you're entertaining either has as its source some form of fear and contraction or some form of expansion and creativity or love. So this second piece around letting go of what is unwholesome is very easy to say, not so easy to do, but there are some helpful guidelines in that. And as you engage in preventive medicine and ask how you can move away from unwholesome states, it kind of leads to this next point, which is to look at how you can bring up the wholesome that is not yet arisen. So how do you cultivate wholesome states when they're not here yet? I talk about traffic in my Dharma talks a lot because I really come to see driving as a spiritual practice, particularly here. In the past, Tara would notice I would become a little bit Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, put me behind the wheel, and I turn into a different person. But I honestly feel like I've shifted a lot over the years. I believe I've told this story before, but before my awakening to driving as a spiritual practice, I was driving on River Road in Bethesda, and this shiny new black Lexus passed me really fast on the left, and then it cut in front of me to pass the car on the left in front of me, but it couldn't get by, so they hit the brakes. So I had to hit the brakes. And obviously, this was a person who was evil, who needed to be punished. So I started tailgating this person to let them know of my displeasure and to remind them of how evil they actually were. And then at some point, it wasn't too long, but I realized how enraged I was. And I still couldn't let him off the hook. But then I realized I am completely caught in a story here. And I realized I was making up stories about this person, how awful they were. And as we're kind of going along, I did back off. And I thought, you know what? Maybe I'm just hallucinating a whole terrible story about them. Maybe it's a completely different story. So I started thinking, maybe this is a mom who's she's late to daycare and just wants to get to her little kid as quick as she can. Or maybe it's a guy who promised his dad at the nursing home that he would be there to take him to a medical appointment and he's late. And I realized that it sort of shifted my inner state. And if you're familiar with River Road, there are lots of stoplights. And somehow, even though I had backed off, the traffic kind of conspired for me to catch up to the black Lexus. And then at one point I passed this black Lexus, and it was a 17-year-old girl just chatting away on her cell phone. But you know what? It didn't matter because I had shifted. And I realized how much I tend to make up stories. And if I can change the stories that I make up. My dog is my model. She just assumes everyone is the greatest person in the world and they're going to love her. And it works. A short reflection, if you would. You just close your eyes for a moment. You might just feel the breath and you might just imagine that the people sitting around you, the people behind you, on either side of you, in front of you, they really admire you. And they really wish you well. Just imagine for a moment that these are truly kind people. And just notice the shift. And if you like, you can deepen your breath and let your eyes open. That practice is not so much about fostering delusion. But there is something about assuming the best, looking for the good. There's a phrase in Sanskrit which was a big part of the ashram where I lived called Aditi Devo Brahma, which means the guest is God. So anyone who would come to the ashram, this was part of our practice, that whoever is presenting themselves to you is God in some form. And it is part of a practice. And, Aditi Devo Brahma. And whoever comes to your home is a visitation from the divine. And it becomes an interesting thing to reflect on and embody. So when you choose to look for the good, it can be a profound and subtle sometimes shift on the inside. A shift in attitude. And it can be a way of kind of up-leveling your experience, of moving from kind of a confined sense of self to an interrelational sense of self. And so this leads to the fourth point for this talk. And that is how to maintain the wholesome states that have already arisen. So if you're feeling healthy and whole and vibrant, how do you maintain that? How do you cultivate that? So I've been flying a lot, teaching here and there, and this weekend I'm flying to Bowdoin College in Maine. I'm going to lead a weekend retreat for the faculty and the students, which I think it'll be cool. So with my travel, I've been encountering the TSA. There are some miserable people who work for the TSA. Maybe you've noticed. So last weekend, I was flying to New England to lead a retreat. And as I was, it was an early flight, and as I was heading toward the TSA, I just saw someone where I just instantly got a vibe of how deeply unhappy this person was. And I could feel myself tighten and kind of get a little bit self-protective. And it was very easy to go into that numb traveler's stance, of keep your eyes down and obey and you'll get through. But for some reason, I just thought, I wonder if I could offer something pleasant to this person. And so as I was sort of going through, I was sort of imagining, and I do this little practice, I've talked about this a lot, where you sort of imagine what the other person's feeling, and then just take a guess and say, I imagine you're feeling. It's a way of kind of like opening up empathy. And I do it in sometimes really inappropriate times, but I thought this would be a good one. So I thought, you know what, she's probably just started, and she's got a really long day ahead of her, and she's probably dreading it, So I just said, boy, you're here early. I bet you've got a long day ahead of you. And then I waited. And then she said, yeah, I do, but I'm happy to have a job. And then she smiled and she laughed. And then it kind of buoyed me up. And I realized that in kind of retrospect, I had a choice. One was to keep my eyes down and stay confined and reinforce my stereotype of this person who wasn't getting anything from me, so they weren't giving anything back. And then I would have carried that on to the next steps I would have taken. But instead, I made a little bit of a shift, made some human contact, and that up-leveled my experience. So I felt a little bit more vibrant and alive as I stepped on. So there's a really interesting little concept I love. And it's the difference between a vicious cycle and a virtuous cycle. The vicious cycle is when something happens, you react in kind of a classical self-protective way, and then you perpetuate the cycle. A virtuous cycle is when something happens and you do something different. And instead of it being kind of a circle, it becomes a spiral. And it can be a very interesting reflection to look at what are all the classic ways you react that reinforce a circle, and how could you respond differently that would create an upward spiral. So again, just a short little reflection, if you will. And you might just sense as you feel the breath what's waiting for you next. Your routines for tonight, and what lies ahead in the morning and your day tomorrow. And is there something that you sense you might be able to transform from being a vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle or a virtuous spiral? Just something you might do different that might up-level your heart and mind and your energy. And if you were to do that, what would that feel like? What would that be like inside? And then again, if you like, you can deepen the breath and you can let your eyes open. I think in many ways when we look at either spiritual practice or skillful living, we're looking at ways that we can increase our energy level. We're looking at how we can build energy. And as you build energy, you build awareness, you build well-being. And when we're gripped by the unwholesome states and we can't shake them off, then we do the downward spiral. We lose energy, naturally, we cycle into a heavy depressive state. And there are certain things you can do, certain practices and attitudes that you'll feel the upward spiral. You feel more alive, and more aliveness begets more possibility. More possibility means you take more risks, more things happen. So in many ways, it's very much about avoiding that which spirals you down, noticing when you're in an unwholesome state how you can shift it, cultivating wholesome states when they're not there yet, and then maintaining those states as you feel your energy spiraling up. There's a great book out there called Your Money or Your Life by Joe Dominguez. And he wrote this a long time ago. The whole idea is about financial independence. And one of his main teachings was about identifying your life energy units. You only have so many life energy units per week. And he has this whole formula you go through where you take your salary and then you include the time you spend commuting, the money you spend on your clothes, the time you spend sick because of stress, the time you spend working when you're not at work. You take all of that and then figure out how much an hour you actually make. And then those become your life energy units. And you realize, oh my God, do I really want to spend 5 energy units on dinner tonight? So one of my teachers talked about how spiritual practice is kind of like having a checking account. There are times when you're putting out more than you're putting in. And there are certain things you can do that add to your checking account. Certain practices, certain activities, certain restraints. You feel better. And then there are certain things you engage into where you're going to be drawing on your checking account. So from that perspective, the question really becomes, what can you do that's going to add to your checking account, that's going to add value, add energy, add a sense of well-being? And everything that's draining your energy, draining your checking account, to really look carefully at that. Is there anything that you could avoid or stop or substitute that might give you more of a sense of well-being as you go through life? And what are the habits that you could cultivate that would be more supportive? Ultimately, I think what it comes down to is about taking responsibility for your own enlightenment. One thing the Buddha said is, no one's going to save you. You are. And there's a certain freedom in that, and there's also a certain responsibility in that. To take a really clear look and not to overuse the word, to ruthlessly evaluate what in your life cultivates unwholesome or unhealthy states, and what could you do that would cultivate more healthy and wholesome states. There are so many practices and teachings and traditions that will tell you what to do. And one of the things I so appreciate about this path, if you will, of Buddhist psychology, is that each of us needs to take responsibility for ourselves. And to really pause and to reflect back on this Eightfold Path, to remember first, what do you want? What do you want out of this precious life? What is most important? And then to look, what's the roadmap? There are those who have gone before us, who have refined practices and teachings and techniques that have some pretty good things to offer. And to look closely at your behaviors, to look closely at how you're living your life, and to look at how you're managing your energy so that you've got the fuel that's going to move you toward what's most important. It's pretty cool stuff. Let's close with a short meditation, and we'll do a little reading. I'll have a short little poem here from Jack London. These lines are from Jack London's work of Credo. I would rather be ashes than dust. I would rather that my spark should burn out in a brilliant blaze than it should be stifled by dry rot. I would rather be a superb meteor, every atom of me in magnificent glow, than a sleepy and permanent planet. Our function is to live, not to exist. I shall not waste my days trying to prolong them. I shall use my time. Let's close with some minutes in silence together. In these final moments, you might reflect on your life as a virtuous spiral. To imagine your life filled with a greater sense of ease, more and more effortlessly guided by wisdom and compassion. Your capacity for joy, compassion for yourself and others, expanding exponentially. And deepening your breath. And when you're ready, you can let your eyes open.